For over 36 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we examine the military situation there. I am Julian Röpke, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we start with images from this morning in the central Russian city of Ufa. There, Ukraine has once again attacked a refinery located deeper in Russia than ever before, specifically with kamikaze drones that were deployed. It is most likely that kamikaze drones were utilized to strike this refinery. We see panicked footage from Russian residents near the refinery who, in over 3 years of war, more than 3 years of Russian conflict, have never faced this before, that their city was attacked and bombed. We have this situation for the first time. We see it from different perspectives that, as mentioned, the large refinery of Ufa is located slightly north of Kazakhstan. We'll look at it on the map in a moment. That this refinery caught fire this morning, and according to consistent Russian reports, Ukrainian long-range kamikaze drones are responsible for it. We are examining the geographical position of Ufa and observe just how astonishingly far away the city is positioned from Ukraine and also from the front line. We have now gone through the calculations and examined the direct air route from the very first location where Ukraine could potentially have launched these drones to Ufa, and remarkably, that distance measures approximately 1,300 kilometers. However, it's actually more plausible that Ukraine launched them not directly from the border itself, but from regions such as Kharkiv, Sumy, or Chernihiv. This would increase the distance to over 1,400 kilometers to reach Ufa, and as I previously mentioned, this is the furthest attack by a Ukrainian kamikaze drone so far. For comparison, we look at Moscow up here. That was attacked over a year ago. Politically, it was then agreed not to do that anymore to avoid provoking Putin or something similar. But for example, in recent months, we've also seen attacks on Kazan more frequently. Refineries in that region have been hit as well, and as a result, their production volumes have been significantly restricted due to these ongoing Ukrainian attacks. Now, the recent attack on Ufa marks the farthest penetration by a Ukrainian kamikaze drone to date. From Ufa in central Russia, we move to Kursk in the neighboring region of Ukraine, where we have new videos showing why the Russian army is slowly but steadily advancing there, having recaptured at least 4 villages in the last 2 weeks. Here we see Ukrainian soldiers moving through one of the remaining held villages, but we also see, and this is the major issue that the Ukrainian generals have admitted in recent days, that the Russians have now advanced so close and are surveilling the area so meticulously that it's possible to see when a Ukrainian soldier moves from point A to point B. And accordingly, those surveillance drones we just saw are then followed by these kamikaze drones with their fiber optic connections. We see that the exact building which was just in sight where the Ukrainian soldiers went in, this exact building is now being attacked by this fiber optic drone, and we witness a very precise explosion. We also have another video which interestingly shows us, by the way, that Ukraine also moved 155mm artillery, in this case M109, into Kursk, essentially attacking from Kursk. And here we now observe the approach of another drone that is guided by fiber optics. And we see at the last moment it's a deeply entrenched US artillery system, the M109 Paladin, which is now being targeted. And we can now also see from the surveillance drone of the Russian army that the target was apparently hit and a fire is breaking out here. There we see the explosion. The surveillance drone also needs to first locate where the attack happened. But now we also see how a fire breaks out, and this is extremely difficult for the Ukrainian army because they are being attacked by so many precise fiber optic guided kamikaze drones from all possible directions. And where these fiber optic drones can't reach or aren't as effective, particularly with the large fortifications of the Ukrainian army, the Russian army in Kursk is using FAB bombs, namely on large glide bombs, and we see one of these attacks here on a building that we've repeatedly seen in recent days, specifically the vodka distillery in Guyevo. Guyevo is a spot right on the Ukrainian border, not directly at the front line, but within the area known as Kursk. And we can see here now that this massive large building is once again being attacked by Russia, specifically with heavy bombs, reportedly FAB 3000. The Russians claim that it is a 3-ton bomb. However, it is also possible that it could be a FAB 1500. That would be a 1.5-ton bomb that still has very devastating effects on its targets. We can observe that the vodka distillery, which has been hit repeatedly over recent weeks, is once again being targeted by the Russians with FAB bombs. This means that the Ukrainians are still suspected to be inside. It's believed that this massive large building, by far the largest in Guyevo, is being used as a base by the Ukrainian army. And the Russians are now trying to show that this time they really hit it, this time it really collapsed. We can see significant destruction here regardless of whether 1.5 or 3-ton bombs were actually employed, and the Ukrainians, if they indeed happen to be there, the question now is whether they are trapped under the rubble, managed to hide in a basement, or used another part of the building. As a result, we have the situation where in Kursk, the Russian army is slowly but surely advancing. After all, yes, Kursk has been partly under Ukrainian control for 7 months. We have just observed the attack on Guyevo, which is strategically positioned roughly in this specific area on the map. And we have just observed that the Russian army, indeed, as you can see up here, that's a stretch of 12 kilometers, which shows that the Russian forces now have the opportunity to advance from various directions, to engage any target within the still occupied areas, as the range of the fiber optic drones has been significantly increased from 5 kilometers to approximately 20 kilometers over the past 6 months. And we can see quite clearly here, once again, in this northern part of the area, the Russians have managed to be pushed back quite significantly over the past 7 days alone. Not only Pogrebki, but also 2 other small villages north of Malaya Loknya, which are now under Russian control. This means the Russians are very serious here. They are advancing further. And we already said in the past few days that we had a piece here, a small aspect, where the Russians crossed the border and moved into Sumy. Not sure if it's clear, but here, this reports from this morning another Ukrainian village in Ukraine that was essentially captured during the Russian counteroffensive reaching Sumy, where the Russians have gained a foothold in Ukraine. And this situation is, of course, challenging for the Ukrainian army. It's a battlefield, regardless of which country you happen to be in. It's a conflict between 2 nations. Accordingly, the Russian counteroffensive, if indeed it proves to be successful, may eventually come to a stop in Kursk. However, it's possible that all the deployed units might continue to advance further towards Ukraine and towards Sumy to re-establish their presence here after 2022. We're coming from Russia to the eastern Ukrainian Donbass to examine 3 key frontline areas where fighting is especially intense now. We're beginning with a frontline area where the situation is going extremely poorly for Ukraine, specifically around Velika Novosilka. Recently obtained footage from the Russian army clearly illustrates they've managed to capture yet another village. Here we can observe the Russian strategy in action. The small village of Skudne has 2 streets that intersect at right angles to each other. And this village was the front, at least in the past few days, but it was heavily attacked by Russian kamikaze drones, as we can see here. We see heavy explosions too, meaning 152mm artillery may have been used. And we repeatedly see how the Ukrainians just barely escape these drones, like the impact here, and then have to move further away because there's simply an overwhelming number of Russian drones primarily deployed. And once again, there isn't any large Russian army here, not with up to 100 or 200 soldiers, nor around 20 vehicles or anything quite similar. The Russians have utilized vehicles here, but at the moment, they seem to have none at their disposal. Instead, we have the situation where a small group of Russian soldiers is trying to move forward, but we also see the Ukrainian defenders, and there are extremely few of them. In all the video material here, we see those fleeing, and it's not around 100 or 50, but perhaps 5, maybe altogether 10 Ukrainian soldiers who have held this village on the ground. That's it. And in that sense, it is possible for the Russians, even if they don't have massive power, even if they don't have a large force here, with their constant kamikaze drone attacks, occasionally with missile and artillery attacks, and indeed with a few soldiers, maybe it's about 20, 30 or 50 on their side, to gain an upper hand and to capture Skudne. Those are supposed to be weapons that were taken into possession, and currently, these are reportedly the Russian soldiers stationed in Skudne. However, these are details that our map provider, which we'll check soon, Deep State Map, also confirms. The Russians have successfully captured Skudne, which is yet another village, making it the 3rd village north of Velika Novosilka that has fallen under Russian control in only 3 weeks. We're looking at the whole thing on the map, and as mentioned, this is the front section where things are currently going the worst for Ukraine, where the Russians can advance almost daily. This is the front where the situation is worst for Ukraine, with Russians advancing almost daily. Northwest, and also from Berlatske to Velika Novosilka, we can take a look at the distance. It's approximately 12 kilometers. The Russian army advanced 12 kilometers here in 2 weeks. That's quite a lot. And if we look at the overall situation, it's almost 50 square kilometers that the Ukrainian army has lost here northwest of Velika Novosilka after this place fell to the Russian army in the winter. As I said, things are going particularly poorly for the Ukrainian army in Velika Novosilka. We're looking at another location where things are going much better for the Ukrainians, namely around Pokrovsk. The former city of 65,000 inhabitants has actually been the center of the Russian offensive for several months, and we see new footage showing us just how incredibly poorly things are going for the Russian army here. Let's first take a look at footage from the Ukrainian army, which shows us what the Russians are advancing with here at this point. Because tanks or infantry vehicles are no longer present here. Instead, they make use of quads like these or motorcycles as shown in the footage. This means, directly near the front line, these recordings from the small town of Yelizaveta, which indeed is quite challenging to pronounce, are situated right at the front. In this area, the Russians are moving unarmored and unprotected on motorcycles and quads from A to B, leading to deadly outcomes for the Russian invaders. We'll see in a moment how kamikaze drones are being used. So there we see the quad with 2 soldiers on it. The soldiers notice the drone approaching, quickly jump off at the very last moment, and the drone then crashes into the quad, causing severe damage to it. One of the soldiers is allegedly wounded as well. We then see the soldiers trying to run away, moving from point A to point B because, as always, there's no rescue chain and no other options. That's the motorcycle we just saw. This motorcycle is also hit by a drone. Here too, it results in a fatal accident, leaving the Russians completely immobilized. Here we see the motorcycle that was used, and here's the quad bike that was used. Both will be destroyed by the Ukrainians afterwards so that they can't be used anymore. So, these are recordings of the logistics, if you can even call it that, the poor logistics of the Russian army near Pokrovsk. However, we also possess recordings from the Russian side that substantiate this situation quite clearly, specifically footage captured from a helmet camera or a dash cam of a Chinese mini buggy, specifically the Desert Cross 1003 model. The Russian army acquired over 2,200 of these mini buggies in the latter part of 2023, and they are currently being driven along here in Pokrovsk. Let's have a look at this. So here's one of these buggies, there's a second one up front, a third one here, and that's an off-road vehicle. This means here too we see the Russians rarely use tanks, and when they do, we see burning tanks and armored vehicles by the roadside. But instead with those peculiar only 16,000 euro cheap Chinese vehicles that really ought to have absolutely nothing at all to do with the war, we see another destroyed infantry vehicle, likely a BMP-2. And now we're also looking at the situation where the Russians, in their little Desert Cross 1003, see Ukrainian kamikaze drones approaching and immediately jump out again. We just saw it with the quad, and now let's look at it from another perspective. Of the Desert Cross mini buggy, and now we've just observed the entry of the Ukrainian drone. Right here on the engine block just a moment ago. The whole thing continues, another vehicle was just hit, and these dashcam recordings show us just how absolutely deadly the final kilometers leading up to Pokrovsk are proving to be for the Russian army, and why there are hardly any vehicles being employed by the Russian side anymore. Or when they do use vehicles, they are the kind that are not actually suitable for war. Another Ukrainian drone appears, hits the engine compartment, and consequently, the drivers once again jump out at the last moment. These are indeed quite spectacular and attention-grabbing shots that once again vividly illustrate how the Russians are maneuvering through the extensive wreckage of their own army around the area of Pokrovsk. And they also show us why, in the end, hardly any vehicle reaches the front. We just witnessed it again. Here they jump out once more, and once again there's a Ukrainian drone strike which ultimately ends up targeting and hitting this particular vehicle in the end. If I'm not mistaken, it's completely destroyed. We'll keep it running for a bit to see just how dramatic the situation is for the Russians. Both vehicles attempt to move aside, jump out again, and now we witness the Ukrainian drone flying in, and then the impact in this Desert Cross, which likely can no longer be utilized after this. We want to take a look at another video from the region of Pokrovsk before we shift our focus to the map, namely from Selidov. Selidov, a former town of 23,000 residents that was captured by the Russians. They had made advances in that area a few months ago near Pokrovsk. Now we observe how, within a single night, a depot containing thermobaric weapons stored in Selidov gets hit by the Ukrainian army forces. And now we see this massive explosion taking place, and you can pretty clearly see that there are very tall buildings around, some up to 12 stories high or more, that are now being torn apart by this thermobaric explosion. This is partly how the TOS-1A, the so-called flamethrower of the Russian army, is operated or supplied with ammunition. And we now see, right in Selidov, how the Russians have established this large encampment which has recently been targeted and hit by the Ukrainian army. This means the defense here in Pokrovsk by the Ukrainians is extremely efficient. There are many very good units there, and thousands of soldiers are stationed here. Quite different from Velika Novosilka, as we just saw. And that's how the videos we just watched can be explained. The quad and the motorcycle were completely wrecked in this location, just as we discussed earlier. We witnessed the massive explosion at Selidov caused by the TOS-1A ammunition, and then there's this so-called road of death. which we frequently brought up. It runs approximately along this path in the direction of the front lines. And that was the road that the soldiers traveled on, who are the ones that were just attacked here in their small Chinese-made buggy. And at the end, we also see the blue areas. That means not only are the Russians not making progress here, but we have in at least 3 locations at Lysivka, Peshane, and Kotline, where the Ukrainian army successfully managed to resist and has indeed made a comeback. And now we have had the situation for several weeks, at least in Peshane, that the Ukrainians have recaptured this place and the Russians currently simply have no options to advance further here. Likewise, Pokrovsk from another direction than before, which also isn't working, as the direct attack failed months ago, to approach Pokrovsk further. Finally, we want to move on to another war zone, namely to Andrivka. Andrivka, another location that has been partially taken over by the Russians, where they are launching aggressive and energetic attacks. However, the Ukrainians are also defending themselves with a relatively high level of efficiency. Here is footage from the 79th Brigade of Ukraine's army, showing another attack with tanks and, in this case, just infantry fighting vehicles, intercepted by the Russians. And as mentioned, we see the impacts on the Russian vehicles all around Andrivka, where the Russians are trying to advance further. It's a moderately fair situation for both Ukrainians and Russians. Russians maintain a strategic advantage here with tanks and IFVs, assets notably absent elsewhere. Even so, the Ukrainians are consistently proving that they are highly effective in defending themselves. The video distinctly shows that both armored vehicles end up getting destroyed in the process, that were just deployed by the Russian army. And we also repeatedly see the approach of the kamikaze drones, and we also saw earlier that sometimes the very large jammers that were affixed to these MTLBs don't provide much assistance here, and the Ukrainian drones managed to ultimately discover a frequency, allowing them to fly through these jammers and directly into the Russian vehicles. We'll also take a look at that on the map and see, as I've mentioned before, a moderately favorable situation for the Ukrainians. On the one hand, there are still a lot of Russians attacking here. On the other hand, we have the situation where, for example, Konstantinopol has been contested for 3 weeks now. The Russians had already constructed a land route to the area, successfully having entered this small place. And nevertheless, the front is holding somewhat here. The Russians are advancing slowly, but very, very slowly. And we also see this around Andrivka, even though a large part of the area, let's mark that, so Andrivka, even though a large part of the area is either under Russian occupation or being contested, that here too the Ukrainian forces resolutely and bravely continue their resistance, and we don't observe any significant westward advance from Andrivka into further territories of Ukraine. Finally, we want to look at images from the former Ukrainian city of Torezk. Once 31,000 inhabitants, now probably around 0. These recordings are very interesting because they show us that the Ukrainian army, here we see the center of Torezk, that the Ukrainian army has seemingly secured a foothold in Torezk's center. Here we see Russian footage recorded from a surveillance drone, and we can observe the attacks targeting one of the houses located in the very center of Torezk. We just saw all those high-rise buildings to the left and right, and this building here was repeatedly attacked by the Russians. This implies we can be sure that the Ukrainian army, having been driven out for several weeks, has now regained presence in the very center of Torezk. This is indicating they have not been completely expelled from the city, or in fact have conducted counterattacks to successfully re-enter and regain control of the city. We want to look at the map for that as well, and that is, as mentioned, something relatively new. Something like that hasn't been experienced at all in recent months, where Ukraine could have fought back into a city. Nevertheless, we see here that these are the outlines of Torezk, and we clearly see a section of the city highlighted in red. Indeed, this area remains occupied by the Russians, about half of it. Still, a considerable section is highlighted in orange. The Ukrainians are gradually but surely making a comeback. That's the present trend. We don't know if that will last. And we also see these parts of Torezk. That means right here in the north and here in the south, which are not at all under Russian control or no longer under Russian control. That indicates that the Ukrainian army has fully re-established their control here. And it remains to be seen who possesses the staying power, who has superior logistics, more advanced drones, and so on, and can ultimately succeed in claiming victory in this ongoing battle for Torezk.